Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'll just wait a few seconds for people to start coming in. It's so great to see so many of you here for the first Big Questions of term. Big Questions is a chance to ask, discuss, and investigate some big questions about life, its meaning, and the claims of Jesus. This term, we have an array of talks planned, and those will be on the flyers that are on your tables, which you're very welcome to take away. Today, we kick off the program with an examination of what it means to be human, asking the question, why are we worthy of human rights? As a law student myself, I've encountered human rights everywhere. The human rights of the strong and the weak, whatever their race, gender, even the human rights of criminals are protected. And these rights seem to attach to the very fact that we are human. But that's not a justification in itself for the degree of protection that we afford to each human being. So there must be a deeper reason why we do believe our humanity means something. Does Christianity, encapsulated in the claims of Jesus, have anything to say to this? That's what we'll be exploring today. Our speaker for today is Michael Ots. He is a speaker and author who travels around the UK and Europe speaking at events like this. In fact, I have one of his books in my hand. This is What Kind of God, which deals with some accusations that are often leveled against the idea of faith. In fact, this book and his other book, What Kind of Hope, are at the back and which are free for you to take away after the talk. So in just a moment, Michael will hop up. After the talk, there will be time for Q&A, which you can ask physically in person, or you can text in your questions through the numbers that are displayed around you. So I'll pass this on to Michael.
Well, it's great to be here, and welcome. I think this is the first time you've done this term. So basically, if you've not been to one of these before, the idea is I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions. So if I'm still speaking in 20 minutes' time, feel free to throw something at me, preferably a baguette, because I haven't had one yet. And then I'll shut up and give you the opportunity to ask some questions. But that's basically the format of where we're going as we look at this topic today. I don't know if you heard the story about the two drunks who came out of a pub one night, and they're a little bit the worse for wear, and they got lost. And as they were stumbling down the street trying to work out where they were, they bumped into a very smart, uniformed naval officer. And one of them looked up at him and, slurring his words, said, "Oi, mate, do you know where we are?" And this man was somewhat offended at their inappropriate introduction, and he straightened up his back, looked down his nose, and he said to them, "Do you know who I am?" To which one drunk said to the other drunk, "Now we're really in trouble because we don't know where we are and he doesn't know who he is." But really that's the kind of question we're asking today, which is basically, who are we as human beings? What is it that gives us value, dignity, and significance? In fact, do we have value, dignity, and significance? Because actually from a material point of view, you might want to say, well, we don't have a lot. From a material, chemical point of view, do you know how much the average human being is worth? Well, apparently it's about £6.50. I did the inflation from when the studies were done a few years ago. But apparently they worked it out by saying, well, in the average human body, there is certain chemical components. You've got enough iron to make a 6-inch nail. You've got enough sulfur to cure a dog of fleas. You've got enough carbon to make 900 pencils, enough potassium to fire a toy cannon, enough fat. Well, this one's kind of debatable, isn't it? Because it's the average human being. But in the average human being, it's 7 bars of soap, enough phosphorus to tip the end of 2,200 matches, and enough water to fill a 10-gallon tank. And that is apparently what you are in chemical form. About £6.50 worth of chemicals. Or think of it another way. I was in New Zealand about a year ago, and I was hiking around the area of Mount Cook, the highest mountain in New Zealand. And I woke up one morning to this incredible view. There's Mount Cook, just illuminated in the morning sun. The valley just swathed in this incredible low clouds. And then this one individual standing out on this rocky ledge, looking out over this vast scene. And a few hours before that, in the middle of the night, I got out my tent. I was freezing cold and I needed to pee. And I got out my tent and I looked up and I looked at the most incredible night sky I've ever seen in my life. It's one of the best places in the world to go and see the stars. And I looked out at this vast night sky, and you think to yourself on those kind of occasions, who am I? As I stood on top of this mountain. Yeah, I am one of 7 billion people living at this current moment in time on planet Earth. This little planet we call Earth is one of several going round our medium-sized star called the Sun, which is one of 100 billion in our medium-sized galaxy, which is one of 100 billion galaxies in the observable universe. Who am I? Pretty insignificant when you think of it that way. And yet, actually, most of us, particularly in this point in history in this part of the world, would say actually human beings do have significance. And we are worth more than £6.50. In fact, if we think about the value of human beings, or what we talk about today, human rights are one of the central pillars, aren't they, of Western civilization. And if you think back over the last couple of hundred years, think of some of the hard-won victories in the area of human rights, human value, and human dignity. Think of the abolition of slavery, or the African-American slave trade, at least 200 years ago. And think of the civil rights movements in America and the massive transformation that brought in society. Think of the increase in things like disability rights from a few generations ago. Think of the increased rights and opportunities that women have in society compared to just 50 or 100 years ago. There are so many advances, are there, in the area of human rights and equality, human dignity. Now, I'm not saying we've made it or arrived, and I think we need to not be complacent on these things. But human rights are things that I guess pretty much all of us, if not all of us in this room, would say are really important. Now, it's also worth saying that actually that presents various paradoxes. And I think in our society there are various paradoxes that we see in this area of human rights. Let me just give you a couple. Think of the increase in disability rights that we have in our society, which is a wonderful thing. But also think of the fact that actually most babies diagnosed with Down syndrome before birth will now be aborted. In fact, think of a country like Iceland, where every single baby for the last few years diagnosed with Down syndrome has been aborted. Not a single child born with that condition in the last few years in Iceland. What does that say to those who are alive who have Down syndrome? Or think of this man. This is John Wyatt. He's Professor of Ethics and Perinatology at University College London. And I was listening to him speak recently, and he said there's a profound paradox in his hospital, University College Hospital in London. Because he says he and his colleagues are spending massive amounts of effort, energy, and money keeping very, very prematurely born babies alive that are actually younger than other babies whose lives are being terminated. The only difference, of course, being that these babies that he is dealing with have already been born. It raises questions, doesn't it? Ethical questions and paradoxes. But I want to say today, this lunchtime, where does this idea of human rights come from? We might think it's just innate, don't we? Everyone believes in it. We might think it's universal. But actually, if you think about it, it is not. Because, of course, there are many cultures and parts of the world today that wouldn't share the same belief or necessarily priority for human rights as we do in the West. So I remember traveling a few years ago and visiting an orphanage for children who had severe physical disabilities. It was an orphanage, I say, but actually none of their parents, as far as we were aware, had died. It was just that in that culture, to be born with serious physical disabilities generally means that you'll be abandoned. There are not the same rights for disabled people in that particular culture. Or think historically, think of the Roman world 2,000 years ago. Did you know, according to the social historian Rodney Stark, in the Roman world there was 60% males to 40% females in the Roman world. Various reasons for that, but one of the major reasons for that was the practice of female infanticide. That generally, often, a female baby would be just left exposed to die. That is an incredible letter that was discovered a few years ago, written by a Roman soldier to his wife. And it's, in many accounts, just the same as any letter that would be written today. It's kind of gushes with his love for her and how much he misses her and so on. And it's evident that she's obviously pregnant, expecting a baby. And then at the end, almost as a kind of PS, he just writes, and by the way, if the baby is a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, kill it. And that's shocking, isn't it, to us? I mean, can you imagine someone writing that to their wife today? And yet that would have been common practice 2,000 years ago. So why is it we live in a society today where the rights of disabled are championed, where the rights of women are championed? Why is it we live in a society like that? And actually, when you survey it historically, you realize it has a large part to do with the influence, actually, of the Judeo-Christian worldview on our worlds. You see, the Judeo-Christian worldview says, right at the heart of it, that humanity has value and significance because we're created in the image of God. So no matter our sex, no matter our abilities, our intellectual capacity or whatever, we all have intrinsic value as human beings created in God's image. And actually, if you look back through history, you see how people who've been influenced by that belief and that conviction have set about to implement that. Think of something like the US Declaration of Independence. Those famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." But that was founded in a deeply Christian conviction that people are created by a God with those rights, and that's where they come from. Or think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed or formed 71 years ago this year. You may or may not know that that was drafted by a guy called Charles Malik, who was a Christian theologian, whose Christian convictions massively shaped the drafting of that historic document. Or, of course, think about through history, some people who have championed the rights of different individuals. Think of someone like William Wilberforce in our country, a Christian politician who fought throughout his lifetime for the end of the African-American slave trade. Or someone like Martin Luther King, a Christian preacher in America in the civil rights movements. Christians who were convinced that people had dignity and value because of their being created in the image of God, and therefore sought to fight for that and to see that implemented in their spheres of society. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the only people today in the world who care about human rights are Christians. Please don't hear me as saying that. I have lots of friends of different beliefs and no belief who also passionately care about human rights. But what I am saying is, why do we care about human rights so much in the West? And actually, historically, it has a lot to do with the way that Christian worldview has influenced the society in which we live and the very thinking that we have imbibed in our society. And can I also say that actually, on the flip side, from a naturalistic point of view, taking God out of the question, it's very hard to find an objective basis for something like human rights without God. Listen to Francis Crick. You may see that blue plaque just down the road outside the old Cavendish laboratory for where he and Watson discovered the double helix structure of DNA. But Crick once wrote this. He said, "You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Now actually, his materialistic worldview is very consistently outworked in that statement. He said that's all you are from a materialistic point of view. Now, I'm not sure how consistent he was. I mean, I'm not sure whether he said that to his wife, on Valentine's Day. To my darling load of nerve cells, my nerve cells love you very much. But actually, that is a consistent outworking. That's all you are, isn't it? I don't know if you've read this book by Yuval Noah Harari. It's a fascinating materialistic take on the history of humanity. And actually, in the book, he looks at the idea of human rights, human dignity, and he says, actually, the only reason why we believe these things is the influence of the myth, as he says, of Christianity upon the Western world. He says there's no objective basis for why we should believe in the fundamental equality of all human beings. Being very consistent. Stephen Pinker, in an article in the New Statesman recently, talked about the stupidity of dignity. He says, actually, consistently speaking, there is no objective basis for thinking that all human beings have innate dignity or innate value. Or the ethicist Peter Singer. He says, actually, the fact that we don't generally practice infanticide in the Western world is a largely is almost exclusively due to the fact that we're influenced by the Christian worldview. In fact, he as an ethicist would argue that maybe we should actually allow it in certain instances. Because he says, actually, logically speaking, why should we not? So actually what I'd say is it's very difficult to find a basis for this belief that we are so passionately convinced of and a naturalistic worldview. But before I finish and before we go to questions, let me say something else. The Christian conviction that humanity has value and dignity doesn't simply stem from the initial Christian conviction that humanity is created in the image of God, although that is foundational. There's another conviction that Christians have that leads to this belief, this conviction. And it's not simply that Christians believe that humanity is created in the image of God, but it's also, according to the Bible, that God himself has become part of humanity, which is an astonishing claim of the Christian faith, uniquely out of all faiths. That the God of the universe, the God who created the universe and you and me, would actually come into that universe as part of his creation and as one of us. And of course, we think about that every year when we celebrate Christmas. That God would become a human being. And yet, if that claim is true, as Christians contend it is, that has a massive implication for your view of humanity, doesn't it? Because it says, actually, as human beings, we are created with innate value, and God has given his stamp of approval on humanity by joining the human race. I mentioned John Wyatt earlier from University College London. John Wyatt was speaking at an event I was at just back at the beginning of this year, and he showed a picture on the screen of a baby that he was or had been caring for. Incredible picture. You see, that's his hand, his full-grown adult hand, and that is the hand of this incredibly prematurely born baby reaching out in the incubator and gripping his finger. It's an incredibly moving image. Sorry, I should have got him to email me the actual image, but that's as good as I can do. But you look at that image, if you can just about make out what it is. And then John asked this question. He said, if you look at that image, if I was to ask you, which is the hand of God? If you were to metaphorically think in that image, which is the hand of God? Which would you say it is? And I guess most of us would naturally say, well, of course, it's the big hand. It's like in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, that hand of God reaching out down to humanity, and others with our puny little hands reaching up to his. But he said, profoundly, he says, actually, the Christian story says, actually, the hand of God is not just the big, strong hand reaching down from the heavens to us in our puny weakness, but actually in Jesus, God was the God who became weak and vulnerable, a fetus in a womb, a baby with no abilities of his own, a refugee on the run with his parents to save his life. And then just an obscure man for much of his life in a forgotten part of a backwater of the Middle East. And the Christian faith says actually God became human. He became vulnerable. And actually that is why humanity has innate value, because God became one of us. And actually wonderfully, when you read through one of the accounts of Jesus' life, as you find them in the Bible, in fact, we'd love you to take one away if you haven't got one. There are some, the one that's called John that's on your tables, that's free for you to take away. But as you read through that, one of the things you just notice that's so astounding about Jesus is the way he treats people that in his society would have been marginalized and ostracized. So you see the way Jesus treats women. We've already thought about how the Roman culture and the Roman world often treated women. But Jesus included women in the people that he taught. No Jewish rabbi would have normally taught a woman. They were involved in his followers. They supported him financially. They were the first witnesses of his resurrection. He treated them with dignity and value and counterculturally. Think of the way he treated others, like the tax collectors or the lepers, people who would have been on the margins of society. Here is Jesus showing dignity and value to those who the rest of society had excluded. And Christians say, actually, we have value not just because God made us in his image, but because God became one of us and then demonstrated in his life what it looks like to treat people with that kind of value. And then ultimately and incredibly, the Christian story crescendos in the ultimate vindication of human value when this Jesus ultimately goes to a cross and gives up his life for us because we are so precious and valuable to him that he would willingly demonstrate the most incredible love so that we could be brought back into a relationship with him. And so actually what I want to say is human values are really, really important, but can I say you will not find a better foundation. In fact, dare I say it, you will not find an objective foundation for it outside of the Christian worldview. That will give you the greatest and the best explanation for why this is important and the best motivation, therefore, to work and live that out in whatever field of life you're in. Now, we need to go to questions, but let me just say before that, you might be here saying, look, I completely disagree with what you said, Michael. And if that's you, then firstly, thank you for coming. And in a moment, feel free to text or ask your questions and tell me why. But if you are saying, look, I just think this is a load of rubbish, I'm not convinced at all by what you've said, can I just encourage you to at least look into this for yourself and to take some time during your time here at university to do that seriously. To think about the basis and foundation for the things that you really care about in life and ask, what is the objective foundation for the things that I really care about? And also ask yourself, does Christianity provide not just a good foundation, but the best foundation? So why not take away this book, as I mentioned, and have a read through that and say, if this were to be true, how would that impact upon my life and what difference would that make? We'd love you to do that. Take that away. That's free for you. It might be that you're here saying, well, actually, I don't think this is rubbish. I'm actually really quite intrigued by this. I'd like to find out more. Well, I'm sure Emily in a little while will tell us other things that are going to be happening. The CICCU here in Cambridge exists to help you investigate these things, and they really want to help you with that. So do keep coming to things like the big questions as well. But I'll hand back to Emily, and then in a few minutes, I think we'll have questions. Okay?
Great. Thank you for your questions. I encourage you to keep texting them in. So we've got a few questions here, but before that, does anyone have any questions to ask in person? Great. I will start with the texted questions. So first, Michael, since you used a quote from Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how would you counter the argument from some that say Jefferson is inconsistent as he himself owned slaves? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So was Jefferson inconsistent? Because on the one hand, he's saying all people are worthy of these rights, and yet, of course, actually in the way that he lived, he owned slaves and therefore wasn't giving rights in that same way to others. And I'd say absolutely, yes, he was. And my claim is not to say that all Christians have been free of hypocrisy or consistent with their beliefs through history. They haven't. And that is the tragedy often, that Christians through history haven't. But what I would say is that therefore the need for Christians is to be more consistent, not less. So think of it this way. You know, when William Wilberforce was standing against the evils of the slave trade, there were plenty of people who in this country would have said, yeah, I'm a Christian and I am in support of the slave trade. But what did Wilberforce say to such people? He didn't say to them, guys, your problem is you're being really Christian and you need to get rid of your Christianity and then we'll get rid of the slave trade. He says, actually, you're not being Christian enough. You're not being consistent with what you claim to believe. You need to be more consistent, not less. Similarly with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, there would have been Christians who would have, again, been profoundly racist in their attitudes. But Martin Luther King didn't say, get rid of your Christianity and then we'll get rid of racism. But he said, actually, you need to be more consistent with your Christian faith. So that's the question I want to ask is, are we being consistent or not? And to do that, we need to say, what is the foundation? What is the conviction that I have? Where does it stem from? And we've seen a trajectory there where people have increasingly thought, what does that look like in different areas and spheres of life? But I'm certainly not saying Christians always have been, or that Christians always get it right today. And Christians can fail, just as we all can. What I would say is that in Jesus, we see someone in whom there is no hypocrisy. And in Jesus, we see the way he treats women, the way he treats the marginalized, the way he treats those which society would have not treated, is incredible and profoundly countercultural. He wasn't just jumping on the cultural bandwagon because everyone else is doing it. He did it at a time when no one else is doing it. I think he is our ultimate model in that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The second question is there a conflict between the human rights of the baby and the human rights of the mother when it comes to abortion? If no, why? If yes, how can we reconcile the two?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it highlights the tension there, doesn't it? I touched on that, obviously, by talking about John White and the kind of paradoxes that they face in somewhere like University College Hospital. And I think I'd say, yeah, there absolutely are two individuals at stake here, the rights of a woman and the rights of a baby, and that's why there are profound difficulties and tensions there. I think the difficulty is often it isn't treated as the rights of two human beings, and it's often treated as the rights of a woman and a fetus who has no intrinsic rights. And I just think there's a tension there, isn't there? You know, when royalty get pregnant, we don't talk about the royal fetus, we talk about the royal baby. And so actually, in many ways, we do treat an unborn child as a baby, worthy of dignity and value. And is it only worthy of dignity and value because it's wanted? Well, what does that say about the rest of society? Are we only given value because of other people's desire for us or interest in us? Or do we have innate value? So I'd say I'm not saying there's easy answers, and there are real kind of ethical tensions there. I'm just saying that is the tension presented. That actually, we need to ask, what are the rights, both of the woman and the child in this case, absolutely. And obviously there's lots of discussion that could be had on that.
Great. So the next question is, what do other monotheistic religions contribute to the argument for human rights?
So what do other monotheistic religions contribute to the question of human rights? Yeah, I talked about the Judeo-Christian worldview. I did that deliberately because obviously in both the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, there is that shared conviction of the Genesis story, the idea of humanity created in the image of God. To an extent, you might say that comes to a degree in Islam, but somewhat differently. It's not exactly the same. That humanity is the creation of God. And therefore has value and dignity and so on. And so you could say, well, that's shared. I think what I'd say is unique or is different, obviously, in the Christian faith, is this idea that God stepped into humanity as a human being. And generally that wouldn't be shared, obviously, definitely not by my Muslim friends, who wouldn't believe that in any way, shape or form, and certainly not most of my Jewish friends. So that central conviction that God not only created us in his image, but became part of humanity, and through his becoming part of humanity, made it possible for broken humanity to be put back together again, which we'll be thinking about, I think, a bit more next week. And I think that is something which we find uniquely expressed in the Christian faith, yeah.
Great. And just before I move on to the last texted question, just a second call if anyone likes to ask a question in person. No. Okay, great. I will go on to the last question. If human rights stem from humans being special because of being created in God's image and God becoming a human, where do animals fit in? Are they worthy of rights?
Yeah, where do animals fit in to this question of human rights? I think that's interesting. I think in sometimes in history, in some parts of the world, there is a danger that things get inverted, and we talk about animals as almost having more rights than human beings. And there are interesting questions on that. But the perception sometimes can be that, well, Christians don't care about animals at all, and animal rights. What's interesting, actually, is that even if you read, say, like the Old Testament part of the Bible, the laws in the Old Testament weren't just to do with how humans treated each other, but actually it had to do with how they treated their animals. So we see, even in the Old Testament, God caring about the rights of animals. That doesn't mean that everyone in the Old Testament was vegetarian. I don't think you can argue that, although there are arguments for people being vegetarian for various reasons, and I'd respect that. But I think the Old Testament clearly does say there are good ways and bad ways to treat animals. And similarly today, I think Christians should care about that too. But I think what the Bible does say is that there is something unique and significant about human beings that sets us apart from the rest of the animals. And it's not simply that we are, intellectually superior and have greater capacities. It is something innately in who we are as human beings, our relational capacity to be able to relate to God himself and to be known by him and to know him, which is significant and different. And so we see that. So that's not to downplay the rights of animals or to say that animals are insignificant, but it is in one sense to upplay the value and significance of a human being and to say, actually, we have real rights and values. And also, one of the responsibilities given to human beings in the Genesis account of creation is this, that what it means to be human and to be created in God's image is to be stewards of the creation that God has made. So actually, what does it look like to be created in God's image? It's actually shown in how we treat the environment. It's how we treat the world around us. So actually, being made in God's image doesn't mean we abuse the rest of the world because it's not important. Precisely the opposite. It says we really care about the world because that's what it means. That's one of our roles and responsibilities. Tragically, as human beings, we haven't always done a good job, have we? But actually, the Bible says that is one of our roles. That is something we should really care about. And that's a responsibility that we have.